You want to know the exact moment I realized my neighbors had confused patience with weakness, and I can tell you because I can still smell it. Hot asphalt, diesel fumes, wet lake air. I woke up at 5:12 that morning with the kind of pressure in my chest that only comes when something is wrong before your eyes are even open. At first I thought it was thunder rolling over the water, but then I heard the steady beep of a dump truck backing up, sharp and mechanical, cutting through the quiet my father used to call the sacred hour, that thin blue stretch before sunrise when the lake looked like polished steel, and every dock, every cypress shadow, every ripple felt like it belonged to the people who respected it. I pulled on my jeans, stepped onto the porch barefoot, and the cold boards hit me a half-second before the sight did. There, along the eastern edge of my lake, where the bank curved inward near the spillway channel, work lights glared across the water and turned the mist orange. Gravel had already been dumped in a long, bright scar along the shoreline. Fresh tire tracks cut through the dew. Men in reflective vests moved around a compact roller while a crew hammered a sign into the ground. Private road. Residents only. On my property. On my lake. For 1 second, I just stood there with my hand on the porch rail, staring at those 3 words like my brain refused to arrange them into something real. Then I saw her. Rebecca Holloway. White blazer. White heels. Not a speck of mud on her. She stood beside a white SUV with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, like she was watching her landscaping crew install flower beds instead of stealing part of a shoreline my family had protected for 43 years. She looked up, saw me on the porch, and smiled that polished country club smile people use when they think paperwork has made them untouchable. I headed down the slope fast enough for wet grass to soak my cuffs, and by the time I reached the bank the smell of tar was thick in my throat. One of the workers lowered his eyes. He knew. They all knew. Rebecca did not even bother pretending this was a misunderstanding. She lifted her chin and told me. The board had approved an access improvement for the community, as if calling theft an improvement made it legal, as if dropping gravel on a flood control edge somehow erased county maps, deed lines, water rights, easements, and 80 years of engineering. I looked past her at the roadbed they were packing over the release corridor and felt something colder than anger settle into place inside me. Because this was not just my shoreline. This was the wrong patch of ground in the worst possible place. My father had taught me every inch of that dam system when I was old enough to hold a flashlight. He taught me how water remembers, how contour lines never lie, and how fools always build like nature negotiates. Rebecca Holloway thought she had taken a piece of my lake that morning. What she had really done was sign her own name to a mistake the lake would never let her keep. Rebecca kept smiling after she said it. Like the words community access improvement were supposed to calm me down, but all they did was make me study the angle of that new gravel strip a little harder. It ran from the cul-de-sac at the north end of the subdivision, down across the old maintenance shelf, then curved along the eastern bank toward the shallow point where the water spread wide after a storm. Anyone looking at it for 5 seconds would think it was just an ugly road. Anyone who knew that lake would see the real problem immediately. They had not built on ordinary shoreline. They had built inside the release corridor. I remember glancing past Rebecca toward the men working the roller and noticing the little details first. A survey flag bent under a tire. A section of black silt fence folded flat in the weeds. Fresh stone already sinking where the bank stayed soft year-round. The whole thing smelled wrong. Not just the tar and diesel. It smelled like warm mud torn open before daylight, like the lake itself had been scraped raw. Rebecca started talking again. Something about improved property values and emergency vehicle access, and how the board had voted unanimously, but I was not listening anymore. My eyes were on the sign they had pounded into the ground. Private road. Residents only. The posts were set maybe 3 feet deeper than they needed to be, and that told me all I needed to know. This was not temporary. They planned to keep it there. They planned to act like it had always belonged to them. I asked one question. Who gave you permission to build here? Rebecca took a slow sip of coffee and said the association attorney had reviewed everything. That was when I finally looked her in the eye. Not angry. Not loud. Just long enough for her to realize I was not shocked anymore. I was measuring. Rebecca had moved into the neighborhood 6 years earlier, and from the day she got on the HOA board, she treated rules like a stage light, something she could turn on other people and keep off herself. She sent violation letters over mailbox paint, lawn edging, basketball goals, flag brackets, and once over a John boat parked behind a privacy fence where nobody but a drone could have seen it. She loved phrases like preserve the character of the community and maintain shared standards. People like Rebecca always do. It sounds cleaner than saying control. But there was one thing she had never understood about this part of the neighborhood. The subdivision ended at the tree line. My land did not. The lake, the dam, the spillway easement, the service shelf, all of that came from a much older property line, one my grandfather recorded before her precious HOA ever existed on paper. My father used to keep the maps in a steel drawer in his office, rolled tight with rubber bands, so old they snapped if you touched them. When I was a kid, he would spread them across the dining room table and tap the contour marks with one thick finger, telling me the land always tells the truth if you know how to read it. I had not thought about those maps in months. Standing there that morning, with gravel pressed into mud where no permanent structure should ever sit, I thought about them all at once. Rebecca must have mistaken my silence for defeat because she gave me that same polished smile again and said if I had concerns, I could submit them in writing to the board. In writing. On my own shoreline. I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded once, turned away, and let her think she had won the first round. By the time I reached the porch again, my feet were wet, my cuffs were muddy, and my mind was already moving faster than the trucks below. Because the moment I saw where they built that road, I knew this was not going to end with an argument. It was going to end with a file drawer, an old survey map, and one rule Rebecca Holloway had never bothered to learn. The office still smelled like old paper, lake dust, and the faint metallic scent that always came off the file cabinets in humid weather. My father had been gone 3 years, but the room still held his habits like they had only stepped out for lunch. Yellow legal pads stacked square. A brass ruler on the corner of the desk. Coffee rings faded into the wood beneath a green glass lamp that had not worked right since the late 1990s. I crossed to the steel drawer at the back wall and pulled it open hard enough to make the runners groan, then started digging through rolled surveys, county plats, easement notices, maintenance permits, and flood control correspondence that went back farther than most of the houses in that neighborhood. Outside, I could still hear the trucks from the shoreline every time the wind shifted, a low grind of engines and reverse alarms drifting through the trees like they were trying to remind me time was running. That only made me move faster. My father believed in paper. He never trusted anybody who said everything important was in an email. He used to tell me that if a man wanted to hide a lie, he would bury it in a meeting, but if he wanted to survive the truth, he put it in a drawer. 20 minutes later, I found the tube. It was shoved behind an old survey tripod in the far corner, capped with cracked red plastic and marked in black ink so faded I almost missed it. Walker Reservoir and Spillway Revision. 1987. I slid the pages free across the desk, and the old vellum curled at the edges like it remembered being folded too long. There it was. Shoreline contour. Service shelf. Release corridor. Elevation notes in my father's block handwriting. And running right through the exact strip where Rebecca had ordered that road built was a shaded zone with the language I had been praying to see. No permanent structure permitted. Within controlled release path. I read it twice, then a third time. Not because I doubted it, but because some winds arrive so quietly you have to sit with them for a second before they become real. Then I found the next piece. A county letter, stamped and dated, acknowledging the operating rights tied to the dam gates and the release schedule after significant rainfall. Then another document. Recorded access for maintenance, limited use only, non-transferable, no board authority granted. That one made me smile. Rebecca had been waving around the word access on the shoreline like it was a crown. What she had was a narrow maintenance reference from decades ago, and even that did not belong to the association. It belonged to the dam parcel. It belonged to me. I spread every page across the desk, lining up dates, legal descriptions, elevations, and signatures until the whole story snapped into focus. They had not just built where they should not have built. They had built on the one strip of land where the law, the engineering, and the water all agreed with me at the same time. That is a rare kind of mistake. The kind that looks harmless to people who think property is just fences and lawns and curb appeal. But this place was never just a neighborhood lake. It was a working body of water with rules older than the subdivision, older than Rebecca's board, older than her attorney, older than every fake little notice they liked to slide into mailboxes. I took photos of every page, scanned the clearest records, and made 3 printed sets before noon. One for my lawyer, one for the county, one for myself. Then I went back out on the porch with the papers in my hand and looked through the trees toward that fresh strip of gravel shining pale in the sun. The roller was still moving. The sign was still standing. Rebecca was still down there, probably believing she had forced me into silence. She had no idea I had spent the last hour finding the exact paragraph that would turn her little road from an act of arrogance into documented, measurable, signed and stamped stupidity. And the more I looked at that road, the more one detail stood out above the rest. They were still building, which meant they were still collecting evidence for me. By late afternoon, the road looked finished enough for Rebecca to start enjoying herself, and that was exactly what I needed. The gravel had been packed smooth, the sign was upright, and somebody from the landscaping crew had even trimmed back a line of brush to make the whole thing more visible from the subdivision entrance. It was the kind of touch people add when they want a bad decision to feel permanent. I stayed out of sight on the porch for a while and watched through the trees with my father's old field glasses, not because I needed a closer look, but because distance makes people careless. Rebecca walked the road twice with 2 board members I recognized from annual meetings, one in loafers, one in golf shoes, both nodding like they were touring a country club expansion instead of trespassing on a release corridor. One of them pointed toward the lake and laughed. Rebecca laughed too. Then she held up her phone and took pictures of the sign, the fresh gravel, and the shoreline like she was documenting a victory. That was the moment I stopped feeling insulted and started feeling grateful. Arrogant people always volunteer extra proof when they think nobody can stop them. I went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and began building a paper trail so clean even Rebecca's attorney would have trouble twisting it. First, I wrote a formal notice of encroachment, attaching the survey excerpt, the restriction language, and the county acknowledgement of controlled release operations. Then I sent a copy by electronic mail to the HOA board, their management company, and the association attorney whose name Rebecca had dropped that morning like a shield. Then I printed the same notice and drove it to the shipping store in town for certified mailing, return receipt requested. I did not want emotion in the record. I wanted timestamps, distances, parcel numbers, elevations, language nobody could misquote later. By 6 o'clock, I had also sent a separate package to my lawyer, a quiet woman named Dana Mercer who had handled a boundary issue for me 2 years earlier and had the rare gift of sounding calm while turning other people pale. She called me before sunset. I put her on speaker and laid the maps back across the table while I walked her through the corridor, the service shelf, the board's false claim of authority, and the fact that construction was still active. She did not interrupt much. That is usually a good sign. When I finished, she asked one question. Had I provided written notice before any weather event could affect the structure? I looked at the clock, looked at the radar on my phone, and said not yet, but I will tonight. Another good silence. Then Dana told me to document everything, avoid confrontation, and issue immediate warning that any structure placed within the release path remained subject to lawful dam operations during rainfall management. I thanked her, hung up, and felt that cold, steady certainty settle deeper into my ribs. Outside, the sky had shifted from white heat to a dull pewter color that flattened the lake and pulled the birds lower over the water. Storm weather. The kind my father could smell an hour before the first drop. I stepped onto the porch again with my coffee and watched the new gravel road fade from pale gray to charcoal in the evening light. The sign still stood there. Private road. Residents only. It looked ridiculous now, like somebody had planted a shopping mall rule in the middle of a system older than the county itself. I took a long sip and listened. Wind in the reeds. A loose chain tapping the dock post. Far off, a low roll of thunder. Then, just before dark, Rebecca came back one more time in that white sport utility vehicle of hers. She parked beside the sign, got out, and checked it with her own hands, pressing one heel against the packed edge to test the firmness like she was inspecting a driveway she had personally commissioned. That tiny gesture told me everything. She trusted the road. She believed in it. She thought gravel and a sign and a board vote had changed the rules of the land. I watched her get back in the vehicle and drive away, and I remember thinking the same thing my father used to say whenever somebody ignored the flood markers. The dangerous part is never the water. It is the confidence people have right before they meet it. Rain started just after midnight, soft at first, the kind that only shows itself as silver streaks under the dock light. By 1 in the morning it had settled into a steady sheet against the windows, drumming on the metal roof, over the boat shed, and turning the yard into dark glass. I did not sleep much. I sat at the kitchen table with the maps, the notices, and my father's old rain gauge logbook opened beside a mug of coffee gone cold an hour earlier. Every few minutes I checked the radar, then the basin totals upstream, then the camera feed pointed toward the service road near the dam house. The numbers were climbing exactly the way late spring systems always climbed out here, not dramatic enough for panic, just persistent enough to matter if you understood what a few inches over several drainage creeks could do by dawn. At 2:17, I sent the formal warning Dana told me to send, stating in plain language that the newly constructed roadway had been placed within the controlled release corridor and remained subject to lawful water management operations associated with the dam. I addressed it to Rebecca, the board, the management company, and the association attorney. I attached the supporting documents again, all of them time-stamped, all of them impossible to claim they had never seen. Then I waited. No reply. Of course, people like Rebecca never respond when the truth first arrives. They wait until it becomes expensive. Around 3:30 the spillway alarms began their low electronic tone test, just a brief cycling sequence I ran before any operational adjustment, and hearing that sound carried me back years in an instant. I was 14 the first time my father let me stand inside the control room during a release. He put one hand on the wheel housing and told me the same thing he always said when other men bragged about forcing the land to obey them. You do not command water. You respect timing, gravity, and design. That lesson sat with me now as the monitors flickered in the dim light and rainwater tracked down the outer window in crooked threads. By 4:40 the inflow readings were high enough to justify a measured gate adjustment under the operating guidelines. Nothing extreme. Nothing theatrical. Just necessary. I pulled on my work jacket, crossed the wet gravel to the dam house, and unlocked the panel with the same brass key I had used for years. The whole place smelled like damp concrete, machine oil, and lake air pushed through old vents. I checked the logbook, recorded the time, the rainfall totals, the inflow rate, and the pre-adjustment level, then rested my hand on the control lever for one long second. Not because I was hesitant, because I understood exactly what would happen next. The new road sat low on the eastern edge where runoff and managed release naturally converged once the basin crossed a certain threshold. Rebecca had built certainty on top of a temporary condition, and that kind of mistake always looks solid until the math starts moving. I initiated the release by the book, lowering the gates in a controlled sequence until the system reached the prescribed 18-inch adjustment. Outside, the sound changed almost immediately. Not a crash, not some dramatic roar. Just the deepening rush of water finding room to move, faster and cleaner through the channel that had been waiting for it all along. By first light the rain had eased to a mist, and I stood on the porch with a fresh cup of coffee watching the eastern bank through the trees. The pale strip of gravel Rebecca had admired the evening before was no longer a road in any meaningful sense. Water had cut through the soft edge, turned the low spots to slurry, and pulled fresh stone sideways into the reeds. The sign still stood for another minute or two, tilted now, stubborn and stupid, until the saturated ground gave up and one post leaned hard enough to drag the whole thing sideways into the mud. I remember staring at that crooked white board, half sunken, the black letters smeared by rain, and feeling something calmer than satisfaction settle over me. I had not touched her road. I had not raised my voice. I had only followed the rules she thought did not apply to her, and in the gray light of morning the lake had begun explaining the rest. Rebecca called me at 7:08 that morning, and I knew it was her before I even picked up because nobody else in my life had ever made a phone ring sound offended. I let it buzz twice while I stood on the porch watching mist lift off the lake in thin gray ribbons. The ruined road sat along the eastern bank like a bad decision left out in daylight, stone washed sideways, edges collapsed, the sign folded into the muck at an angle that somehow still looked arrogant. When I answered, Rebecca did not say hello. She demanded to know what I had done. Her voice came sharp and breathless through the speaker, the voice of someone who had gone to sleep believing in control and woken up knee-deep in evidence. I told her exactly what I had done. I had operated the dam in accordance with the recorded guidelines after measurable rainfall, and I had warned her in writing before the adjustment. There was a silence on the line, so tight I could hear the faint hiss of her car vents. Then she said the road had been approved by the board. I told her the board did not outrank gravity, county records, or controlled release law. That landed harder than any raised voice could have. She hung up on me before I finished the sentence. By 8 o'clock the neighborhood was stirring like word had passed house to house before coffee finished brewing. Vehicles slowed near the subdivision entrance. 2 residents stood at the edge of the damaged road in rain boots and crossed arms, staring at the washed gravel with the confused look people get when they realize the official version they were fed does not match the ground under their feet. I watched from the porch as Rebecca arrived in that white sport utility vehicle again. Except this time, there was nothing polished about the scene. Her heels sank on the first step. She switched to the grass, trying to salvage dignity, but the bank was saturated and every move left marks. One board member joined her, then another, and within minutes all 3 were gesturing at the road, the lake, the broken sign, and each other in short, jerky motions that carried clearly even without sound. That was when my phone lit up with the first email from the management company. Subject line, urgent request for immediate clarification. I opened it at the kitchen table while rainwater still tapped from the porch roof outside. The message was carefully worded, almost comical in its attempt to sound neutral. They wanted to know whether I had intentionally altered water flow in a way that affected association property. Association property. I smiled at that and forwarded the email directly to Dana, then replied with 1 sentence and 4 attachments. The sentence stated that no association property rights existed within the controlled release corridor and that all operations had been conducted lawfully after formal written notice. The attachments were the survey, the county acknowledgement, the recorded restriction, and the warning I had sent at 2:17 that morning. Less than 10 minutes later, Dana called. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She said the board had a problem. The management company knew it, and the only question now was whether they would try to bluff their way through one more day before the county made that impossible. While she spoke, I stepped back onto the porch and looked toward the shoreline. Rebecca was bent over the fallen sign, trying to pull it free from the mud with both hands while a gust off the water snapped her hair across her face. Even from a distance, I could see the change in her. The certainty was gone. In its place was something much more honest. Embarrassment. Not because nature had been unfair. Not because I had surprised her. Because every warning she ignored was now sitting out in public where residents could see it with their own eyes. The road had not failed quietly. It had failed in broad daylight, in front of the people she had promised to lead. And standing there with the damp wood cool under my bare feet and my father's records waiting on the kitchen table behind me, I realized the real damage was only beginning. The gravel could be replaced. The sign could be reprinted. But once people saw that Rebecca had built confidence on land she did not understand, nothing in that neighborhood was ever going to look as solid again. By noon the county truck rolled in, white door seals streaked with road grime, tires crunching over the same gravel Rebecca had been so proud of less than 24 hours earlier. I saw it from the kitchen window while I was printing one more copy of the survey set, and I will admit there was a kind of quiet satisfaction in watching official attention arrive without me having to chase it. Dana had done what Dana always did. She had taken a messy local power play and translated it into language institutions actually respected. Parcel encroachment. Unpermitted construction within a controlled release corridor. Notice provided. Documented risk. Those words travel faster than outrage ever will. By the time I stepped onto the porch, the county inspector was already standing near. The collapsed edge of the road with a measuring rod in one hand and a clipboard in the other. He was a tall man in a faded tan rain jacket, late 50s maybe, the kind who did not waste movement. Rebecca was talking before he even finished looking at the bank. I could not hear every word from that distance, but I caught enough. Unexpected washout. Emergency access. Shared benefit. Temporary damage. She kept trying to frame the problem like weather had singled her out unfairly. The inspector did not argue. He just kept taking measurements, glancing at the exposed edge where the stone had slumped, then down toward the flow line where the water had done exactly what the contour map said it would do. 2 more residents had gathered by then 4, then 6. Neighborhood curiosity moves fast when authority starts sounding uncertain. I walked down with my file folder tucked under one arm and the wet grass soaking through the cuffs of my jeans again. Same as the morning before, except this time nobody looked at me like I was the obstacle. They looked at me like I might be the only person there who understood what had happened. Rebecca saw me coming and straightened at once, shoulders tight, jaw set, one heel stained brown from the mud despite her obvious efforts to stay clear of it. She said my name like it tasted bad and told the inspector I was exaggerating a private disagreement into a public matter. That was the exact phrase she used. Private disagreement. I handed the inspector the survey, the release restriction, the county acknowledgement letter, and the warning notice with the electronic mail timestamp attached. He took the pages, read the first one, then the second, then flipped back to the map and asked me one question in a calm, flat voice. This road was built here after notice of the corridor boundaries was available in the recorded documents. I told him yes. Rebecca cut in immediately and said the board had legal review. The inspector finally looked directly at her then, and for the first time all day she stopped talking on instinct alone. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He only asked whether the board had obtained county approval for permanent construction inside a controlled release path. Rebecca tried to pivot to beautification, community use, maintenance access, anything that sounded less reckless than the truth. It did not work. Facts have a way of emptying the air out of decorative language. The inspector marked something on his clipboard, took photographs of the damaged edge, the sunken sign, and the fresh grading near the bank, then said he would be issuing a stop order pending review and that no further work was to continue on the site. One of the residents actually laughed under his breath when he heard that. Not cruelly, just with the stunned disbelief of someone realizing the emperor had not only lost her robe, she had signed for the tailoring bill herself. Rebecca turned red all the way up to her hairline. She opened her mouth, closed it, then asked who had filed the complaint. The inspector said he was not there to discuss complainants. He was there because the site conditions and the documents raised compliance concerns. That answer hit her harder than if he had pointed at me. She wanted a personal enemy she could frame as difficult. What she got instead was process, procedure, record. That is the thing people like Rebecca never understand until it is too late. They are excellent at managing appearances inside small rooms, boardrooms, clubhouses, social pages, email chains. But once the matter leaves the room and enters a system built on plats, signatures, rainfall logs, and county code, charm becomes almost useless. I stood there with the lake breeze drying the damp collar of my shirt and watched the inspector press a bright notice packet into Rebecca's hand. The white paper looked almost luminous against the mud stain on her fingers. Around us the neighborhood had gone very still. Not silent, just still in that charged way a place gets when everybody senses a story changing shape in real time. And as Rebecca stared down at that packet, blinking fast, I realized the road had never really been the prize. Control was. The sign, the gravel, the board vote. All of it had been theater meant to prove she could redraw the edge of my world because she felt like it. But now the county had given her something much harder to spin than a washed-out road. They had given her a record. And records, unlike rumors, do not care who used to run the meeting. The homeowners meeting that Thursday night started 10 minutes late and still somehow felt early, like the room itself had been waiting all week for this exact collision. The clubhouse always smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, burnt coffee, and air conditioning pushed too hard through old vents. But that evening there was something sharper underneath it all, the scent of wet umbrellas, tension, and people arriving with opinions already loaded. I took a seat in the back row with Dana beside me and a slim file folder on my lap, while Rebecca stood near the front in a cream blouse and a new pair of shoes she had clearly chosen with more caution than pride. She had the look people get when they are trying to hold a version of themselves together that reality has already rejected. One board member kept shuffling papers. Another would not make eye contact with anyone. Residents filled the folding chairs faster than I had ever seen, and not because they cared about drainage law. They came because nothing draws a crowd like the first crack in borrowed power. The meeting opened with routine items that nobody was really listening to. Landscaping bids, pool furniture, fence stain colors. All of it floated past in a haze until Rebecca cleared her throat and moved to the matter of unauthorized interference with association infrastructure. That phrase hit the room like a cheap perfume, too strong and trying too hard. Dana leaned back in her chair and folded her hands like she had all the time in the world. Rebecca launched into a polished summary about unexpected weather, misunderstanding of shared access, and a regrettable escalation by a neighboring owner. Neighboring owner. I almost smiled. She had built a road across my shoreline, ignored written notice, received a county stop order, and now she wanted to reduce me to a difficult neighbor. Then came the mistake that ended her. She clicked the remote for the projector and put her own email on the screen. I recognized it instantly because she had copied half the subdivision on it 2 days before the rain. Subject line, progress on lakeside access improvement. There it was in bright clubhouse light for every resident to see. Photos of the gravel road. Photos of the sign. Photos of the shoreline. And below them, her own words, cheerful and confident, thanking the board for moving quickly on along. Overdue private road enhancement despite likely objections from adjacent owners. Adjacent owners. Plural, as if reducing me to a category made the theft sound less personal. But the line that mattered came 3 sentences later. We are moving ahead before county review slows the project down. Dana did not even look at me. She just stood, asked for the remote, and requested permission to address the board. The room changed the second she started speaking. No heat, no drama, just sequence. Recorded corridor restriction. Property survey. Written notice. Dam operating authority. Rainfall event. Lawful release. County inspection. Stop order. Then she asked Rebecca to confirm whether the email on the screen had been sent by her at 4:36 in the afternoon the day before the storm. Rebecca tried to qualify it. Draft language. Planning context. Informal communication. Dana asked again, softer this time, which somehow made it worse. Did you send this message? Rebecca said yes. The silence that followed was the kind that makes people aware of every tiny sound in a room. A chair leg scraped. Somebody coughed into a napkin. Ice settled in a plastic cup near the coffee station. Then a man from the 3rd row raised his hand and asked the question nobody on that board wanted to hear. If county review was being avoided on purpose, had HOA money been used for work the board knew might not be legal? That was the moment the meeting stopped belonging to Rebecca. The second resident asked about liability. A woman near the wall asked whether homeowners' dues paid for the gravel. Another asked whether the board had insurance coverage if the county imposed penalties. The board member in loafers looked like he wanted the carpet to open up beneath him. Rebecca kept trying to answer in broad, clean phrases, but broad, clean phrases do not survive contact with receipts. Dana held up the certified mail record, then the warning notice, then the county packet number, each one like a quiet metronome counting down the last seconds of a performance everybody had finally stopped believing. By the time the board called a recess, the room had turned on Rebecca without anyone having to shout. People did not look angry as much as embarrassed for having trusted her. And sitting there with that cold clubhouse air on my neck and my father's paper trail spread in perfect order across my lap, I realized the road had washed out in one night. But the real collapse was happening right there under fluorescent lights, in front of neighbors, under her own projector, with her own email still glowing on the wall. The recess lasted 22 minutes, and when the board came back into the room, something had shifted so completely that even the air felt different. Rebecca was no longer standing at the center of the front table. She was off to the side now, arms folded too tightly, lips pressed flat, while the vice president cleared his throat and read from a sheet of paper with the stiff, careful voice of a man trying not to become the next headline in a neighborhood scandal. The board was suspending all work connected to the shoreline project. They were commissioning an independent review of expenditures, authority, and permitting. They were notifying the association insurer. And pending that review, Rebecca Holloway was stepping aside as acting president. Nobody clapped. That was the part one remember most. No cheers. No celebration. Just a long exhale moving through the room like pressure leaving a pipe. Because by then this was bigger than a personal feud. People were not looking at a dramatic victory. They were looking at invoices, liability, legal exposure, and the uncomfortable fact that somebody they trusted had gambled with all of it to feel powerful over a piece of land that was never hers. Rebecca asked to respond, and the board let her, which turned out to be one final gift to the truth. She stood there under the fluorescent lights with her voice polished smooth again, trying to gather the old version of herself around her like a coat that no longer fit. She said every decision had been made in good faith. She said the project was meant to benefit the community. She said she regretted any confusion. Confusion. That word floated out into the room and died there. Dana did not even bother standing this time. She only asked whether good faith included sending an email about moving ahead before county review slowed the project down. Rebecca stared at her, then at the projector screen that was now dark, then at the residents who had already seen the message with their own eyes. There was nowhere left for her to place the blame. Not on weather. Not on me. Not on misunderstanding. Facts had closed every door. The meeting ended 40 minutes later with more questions than answers for the board, and that was exactly how it needed to end. Real consequences are rarely cinematic in the moment. They come dressed as audits, reimbursements, resignations, insurance calls, and lawyers who suddenly stop smiling in email signatures. Over the next 2 weeks, the county required remediation of the damaged corridor. The association had to pay to remove what remained of the road, restore the bank, and bring in an environmental contractor to stabilize the shoreline properly. Residents learned their dues had funded the entire mess. Rebecca resigned before the full financial review was completed. I heard she moved out before summer ended, though by then I had stopped caring enough to confirm it. The last morning I saw any trace of that road. A crew was pulling the broken signpost from the mud while a heron stood in the reeds 10 yards away, still as a fence post. Watching men clean up a mistake nature had already judged days earlier. By dusk the gravel was gone. The scar along the bank had been smoothed back into contour. Water moved through the corridor the way it always had, without speeches, without anger, without asking anyone's permission. I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and the old survey map folded beside me, and I thought about my father at the dining room table, tapping contour lines with one thick finger and telling me the land always tells the truth if you know how to read it. He was right. Rebecca had looked at that shoreline and seen a place to plant authority. I looked at it and saw memory, design, law, and consequence all braided together. That was the difference between us. She believed control came from signs, votes, and polished language. I knew real control starts with understanding what existed before you arrived and what will remain after you are gone. In the end, I did not beat Rebecca by shouting louder, moving faster, or playing dirtier. I beat her by waiting, documenting, and letting her own confidence walk straight into a landscape that had never agreed to obey her. The lake never took my side. The county never did me any favors. The truth was simpler than that. She built a lie in the one place where water, law, and time were guaranteed to expose it. And when they did, all I had to do was stand still and watch everything return to its proper line.